It is bad enough that the Alberta government misleads its public about the supposedly settled science of climate change. But in mid-March, they took the same flawed message to the United States in one of the worst public relations mistakes of all time. The government of Alberta supported the climate scare in America's leading newspaper, the New York Times. When Alberta Premier Alison Redford travels to Washington, D.C. in April to lobby for the Keystone XL pipeline, she must say nothing that would support the controversial and probably wrong idea that humanity's carbon dioxide emissions are causing dangerous climate change. After all, the ultimate aim of climate activists is to end our use of fossil fuels entirely. Why would a province that derives most of its income from those resources support a movement that is trying to kill the market for the same resources? Premier Redford should prepare for the upcoming meetings by reviewing the very serious strategic mistakes in the advertisement her government recently took out in the Times. As a sample of the sorts of things to avoid in future Keystone XL marketing, I deconstruct Alberta's New York Times ad in this video. It's appropriate to start with a little bit of history as to how this came about. On March 10, 2013, the New York Times published an editorial entitled, "When to Say No." Here's what they said. He, in other words, President Obama, should say no, and for one overriding reason. A president who has repeatedly identified climate change as one of humanity's most pressing dangers cannot, in good conscience, approve a project that, even by the State Department's most cautious calculations, can only add to the problem. The New York Times continued to say, that decision, in other words, the decision yes or no concerning the Keystone XL pipeline, will say a lot about whether Mr. Obama and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, are willing to exert global leadership on the climate change issue. In itself, the Keystone pipeline will not push the world into climate apocalypse, but it will continue to fuel our appetite for oil and add to the carbon load in the atmosphere. There is no need to accept it. So how did the Alberta government respond to this attack? Well, according to Canadian press, a spokesman for Alberta Premier Alison Redford said that the Alberta government tried to get a guest column, an op-ed of their own, in the Times, but they were turned down. So what did the Alberta government do? The Alberta government paid $30,000 to the New York Times to buy advertising space to counter the Times editorial. It does seem ironic that the New York Times would benefit financially from the government of Alberta for attacking the government of Alberta's most important project. So here's the advertisement as it appeared in the New York Times on March 17, 2013. It was entitled Keystone XL, The Choice of Reason. The first part of the ad is simply boilerplating, educating the public about events to date. These are good things for the American public to know, and certainly this part of the ad is no problem. Let's take a look at the next part of the ad. It's why Keystone XL is the choice of reason, and these are indeed legitimate economic benefits of the project. There's no problem here. On the far right side, we see the same is true of a third bullet in the third part of the advertisement. The problem arises in the rest of the third part of the advertisement. Let's examine closely why these three bullets are a serious public relations mistake. First of all, here's bullet number 1. Alberta, Canada was the first place in North America to legally require all large industry to curb greenhouse gas emissions, and Alberta already has a $15 price on carbon. Let's look at these words, curb greenhouse gas. Okay, this implies that greenhouse gas emissions should be legally curbed as if it were pollution. But the greenhouse gas they're mostly speaking about is carbon dioxide, which is not a pollutant. Indeed, carbon dioxide is the stuff of life. It is essential for plant photosynthesis. The increase in carbon dioxide has resulted in more crop yield across the world and a densification of forests. Of course, the reason that climate campaigners want to see CO2 emissions cut is because they believe that it's causing a climate crisis. However, this is a very improbable hypothesis, so it was vastly premature for Alberta to impose mandatory regulations on CO2 emissions. It's certainly nothing to boast about. Let's look at the words price on carbon. In fact, Alberta does not have a price on carbon. Alberta's tax is on carbon dioxide. It's a benign gas that is just one of thousands of compounds that happen to include carbon. The misnomer of calling carbon dioxide simply carbon has a very serious consequence. Most people think of carbon as something dirty, like graphite. But in fact, carbon dioxide, as we said earlier, is a benign gas. Carbon is in you and me. It's in birds and trees. It's also in poisons such as PCBs. Carbon is also in carbon dioxide, but that is certainly not a pollutant. Dropping the two oxygen atoms off of the CO2 molecule and simply calling it carbon makes about as much sense as dropping the oxygen atom off of water, H2O, and calling it hydrogen. Imagine getting your next water bill labeled your hydrogen bill. The carbon label for carbon dioxide is no less deceiving and no less problematic either. Now let's take a look at the second bullet in the third part of the Alberta government advertisement. Alberta, Canada is committed to pushing the bar higher on its leading climate change policy that already includes a $1.3 billion investment in carbon capture and storage and a fund that is helping to finance more than 40 clean technology projects. Now, there's a number of problems here. First of all, a leading climate change policy for a northerly region such as Alberta would be one that focused on preparing the province for cooling, not warming. You see, only a small drop in temperature is needed for us to lose a lot of our wheat crop on the prairies. So, indeed, we should be preparing for the possibility of cooling, which some scientists, especially those that work in the solar science area, say is more likely. If it warms somewhat or even a great deal, all we need to do is adopt farming practices used to the south of us, let's say in Arkansas. However, Alberta is focused on the possibility of non-dangerous warming, not the cooling that could in fact hurt their productivity a great deal. The next problem with Bullet 2 is their reference to a $1.3 billion investment in carbon capture and storage. Of course, once again, they're talking about carbon dioxide, so that's a misnomer. But regardless, this is a waste of money, trying to store carbon dioxide underground because of its possible effects on climate. It is also potentially dangerous for those who live near a storage site. Regardless, many scientists say it will have no measurable impact on global climate. The final part of bullet number 2 is also problematic. They're talking about clean technology projects. This, again, is a misnomer. These projects focus primarily on reducing carbon dioxide, which is in no way unclean. Bullet number 4 of the third part of the Alberta government advertisement is a strange one. From a marketing perspective and a science perspective, this is either illogical or irrelevant. Think of it. If Americans read this ad and they think that CO2 emissions are a serious problem, then they would undoubtedly conclude that we should be pulling our weight as part of a worldwide effort to save the climate. And if carbon dioxide is not a problem, then the claim is irrelevant. This should not be in there. Imagine if this was the philosophy that was used during World War II. A soldier could say, "Oh, what is my contribution to the war? It's very small. Why don't I just stay home?" Well, fortunately, our veterans did not take that approach. They knew that it would set a terrible example, and we were fighting against a very serious enemy, and every contributor was important. This is indeed the kind of argument that climate campaigners use all the time. We are facing a global crisis, they say. Everyone must contribute to solving the problem. Intellectually, if you accepted the climate scare as reality, then indeed they would be right. And so this marketing approach not only gives credibility to the climate alarmist cause, but it also will appear illogical and immoral to many who actually believe the science behind the climate scare. The Alberta government advertisement also directs the public to this website. And here's one page on that website. Let's take a close look at what they're actually saying. To meet global targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and avoid irreversible climate change, a collection of different actions is needed from countries around the world. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the U.S. administration, and our own federal government agree that carbon capture and storage is crucial to help the world make necessary long-term reductions in greenhouse gases. Now, it's important to know that large-scale CO2 capture and storage will not be possible before the 2020s at the earliest. Concerning the Alberta government ad in the New York Times, it's a very serious public relations mistake, because it effectively is feeding the fire that is threatening to burn down the province's major source of wealth, its fossil fuels. If you indeed do support the idea that carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels are causing a climate crisis, then you are in fact supporting the eventual outcome of the climate campaign, and that is indeed to end the use of all fossil fuels. So what should the Alberta government have said in their advertisement? Here's a responsible and correct message. The science of climate change is immensely complex. While the field is advancing, it is not yet sufficiently mature that meaningful forecasts of future climate are possible. The influence of human-induced CO2 emissions is even less well understood. However, we recognize that many Americans are concerned about the possibility of climatic problems due to CO2 emissions from the oil sands. Consequently, the government of Alberta is taking the following steps. Number 1. We are convening open, unbiased hearings into the climatic impacts of the oil sands. Qualified scientists who specialize in climate change causes will be invited to testify, regardless of whether they do or do not support the hypothesis that CO2 emissions are a significant driver of global climate change. As a footnote, the government could say to justify their actions, for too long, governments have promoted the idea that there is only one correct position on climate science. This is a mistake. No responsible government should spend billions of taxpayer dollars on an issue without thoroughly examining all reputable points of view. We will now do this on the climate file and encourage other governments to do likewise. The government of Alberta will continue to take no-regrets actions to save energy and reduce air, land, and water pollution where they cause problems. This will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2, as we increase efficiency. Some people watching this video might wonder why I'm recommending including the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions as part of this message. Well, there's nothing specifically wrong with reducing CO2 if indeed it's done as part of a no-regrets policy, if it's a concomitant benefit, quote unquote, as we increase efficiency. Since many people are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, it's important for them to know that no-regrets actions to save energy and reduce pollution will indeed, in most cases, also reduce carbon dioxide. However, if the focus is on carbon dioxide, we end up with plans such as sequestration of carbon dioxide underground, which actually increases pollution and reduces energy efficiency. So, greenhouse gas reduction is a side benefit of reduction of pollution, but it's not something we should focus on. The third recommended message for the government of Alberta would be the following. We will continue to fund research into the causes of climate change with a goal of someday being able to more accurately forecast future changes. This will allow society to better prepare for whatever climate change awaits us in the future. Finally, the government will continue to implement adaptation measures to help our citizens prepare for future climate challenges, cooling and warming, drought and flood, and other changes possible in our highly variable and unpredictable climate. The real cost to Albertans of the New York Times ad was far more than $30,000 because they effectively supported the main argument of their opponents. This approach will sway no one, and if they continue this way, it's a one-way ticket to a future with no Keystone XL, no Northern Gateway pipeline, no oil sands, and ultimately no coal, oil, or natural gas either. Canada will then become a nation of have-not provinces. We'll be relegated to living off the charity of countries that did not destroy their economies in a vain attempt to please climate campaigners. We're interested in your comments about this video and about anything else we do. If you'd like to contact me or others at the International Climate Science Coalition, here are our coordinates. I work as an advisor to the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and here is how you can get a hold of them at the following webpage.